Así que I'm going to switch to English now because Charles, you know what's coming. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and tell us hello and a fun fact.
Hello, Ale, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Yeah, my fun fact, I don't know if it's fun or not, but I'm very proud of being able to not kind of lose my mind after 8 weeks of being in lockdown, locked in my apartment here in Shanghai. So I'm quite proud of myself that I'm able to be coherent and still be able to participate in this. Great to see everyone.
Oh my God. Thank you so much for that, Charles. Yes, that's right. You guys have been like in quarantine again. So sending you a lot of good vibes there. And so good you are here with us today. I know it's early morning, right? It's 7 a.m., 8 a.m.?
8 a.m., not too bad, yeah.
8 a.m., great. So good morning. Here we are in the past in Latin America. I know you guys are in the future. It's tomorrow. So thank you for that. Tell us what happens. And now I'm going to proceed to present Nicole. I'm going to do it in Spanish, but then I'm going to say something in English. So you guys also have that. Entonces, Nicole Perret, que está por ahí, ahora también le voy a decir que prenda su cámara y nos diga hola. Es la CEO de Conoce Coaching and Consulting. Ella es coach organizacional y de vida, enfocada en el desarrollo y transformación de los seres humanos, llevándolos a alcanzar resultados extraordinarios. De hecho, también tiene una certificación en coaching ontológico por The Newfield Network, perteneció al directorio de la International Coaching Federation y fue miembro del comité organizador del primer Congreso Internacional de Coaching. Y de hecho, ahí se me acaban los bullet points porque no hay espacio, pero Nicole tiene un montón de certificaciones hermosas. De hecho, también es parte de nuestra ruta, así que ahí metiendo un poco de cherry de toda la ayuda que nos ha brindado el colectivo. Es practitioner también en colectivo y ahora voy a buscarla por acá para que, Nico, si puedes prender tu cámara, ya estás por ahí,
acá
y
estoy,
nos digas, hola, y nos cuentes tu fun fact. Me intriga un poco lo que has puesto por ahí.
Súper, Ale, gracias por esa presentación. Feliz de estar aquí y ser parte del equipo de Colectivo 23 también. Y mi fun fact, efectivamente, es que soy hija de chef, pero no sé cocinar. O sea que vengo de la mano por 35 años de ver un papá que ha cocinado de todo, que tiene una cadena de restaurantes, pero yo con las justas hiervo agua. La pandemia ha sido un gran aprendizaje para mí, para llegar a un huevo revuelto, pero ahí estamos, ahí en el proceso.
Gracias, Nico, por contarnos eso. Demasiado bueno tu fun fact. Y entonces ahora voy a pasar a inglés nuevamente. So I'm switching to English again. And the next slide is actually not mine. So I'm just giving the floor to Charles. Maffer is still going to control the slides, but I'm just going to drop the floor for you. So go ahead.
Thank you. Hola, everyone. Again, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that introduction, Ale. I'm really looking forward to connecting with you all here today. And I just wanted to share some thoughts on leadership. I've collected a bunch of things. It's, one of the things about what I'm going to share is that I don't think there's one perfect answer about, how to be a perfect leader or what kind of leadership style is perfect for every situation. It's really up to the individual. And so I've laid out many things that I've learned that I was excited to share with you. But I hope that each of you take, what you think is important for your own practice and for your own thinking around your context. So, so let me just start with 3 quick stories that kind of give you more of a sense of what I've learned that's great. Since this COVID time. These are very specific to COVID. So the first is, I'm actually a very avid motorcycle rider, particularly an outdoor adventure rider, which means I've ridden motorcycles on 4 different continents. My next one, my only one that I still don't have on my list is Latin America. That is definitely next. But I started when I was 12, and it has always been an opportunity for me to escape and it quiet the mind. And I get into this very meditation-like state when I go riding. And for the last couple of years, I haven't been able to do it at all. And so on the right is actually a picture of my dog, Huli. It's a Siberian Husky. And she and I, the most outdoor we get is out for walks and running together. But I've learned how to quiet the mind without being able to escape into nature. And so that's been, this practice of mindfulness has been something that has become very important to me in recent times. And then the next thing about me is that I picked up kind of a new craft. And that has been, if you go to the next slide, I think I've had some very existential moments. You know, you go very philosophical in the COVID times when you're locked out and you're on your own head. And I started reading Kafka and Camus and books like that again, you know, and actually I found a new practice in sculpting and miniature model making inspired by scenes and stories from existential novels. So I've gotten into this whole world of like making with my hands and thinking through these philosophical ideas by expressing them in these kind of like weird kind of machine-like expressions. So that's the second one. And then the third one about me is that I've completely degened into the world of NFTs. So please don't judge me. You know, I've just found it to be an amazing world. I wanted to learn about Web3 and crypto, and it has given me a whole new community of people to speak to in Discord channels. And I just love meeting artists and other people who are trying to disrupt traditional ways of everything from music to art. And I've just really enjoyed collecting, trading, and then meeting the community there. So these are three things that have really changed only in like the last 2 years for me, but have been really key to informing like how I show up actually as a leader and how I stay inspired. All right, so the next slide, I want to dive into this first. I've got 4 big ideas, I guess, that I've kind of taken very seriously. And again, take what you'd like. But the first one is that for me, when we think about leadership, I think it's very much important to think of it as a mindset, not just a role or a title, right? So anyone can choose to lead at any moment, right? And that is simply a matter of understanding and thinking about what is needed, the context, and then how to show up for other people in service of them in a moment, right? And so the next slide is just an article. If you want, throughout this, I've got books and articles in here. If you want to take a photo of the screen or screen grab it, this is actually an article that was co-written by Stanford University and an IDEO partner that talks about how culture inside of companies change and that movements are much more powerful than mandates. So if you think about how this might relate to you as a leader, you know, there's an option to make a mandate and tell everyone to behave in a certain way and be creative or, you know, be efficient or be whatever. But movements are things where you start small, you find people that have common interest, and then you start to create more and more confidence in it by showing early action and early wins. And eventually it moves the entire organization culturally, but it's done from the bottom up rather than the top down. And so I would encourage you to take maybe a look at this article. It might give you some ideas of ways you can engage inside of your own corporate cultures and as a leader. And then going on to this, so I've experimented with this in Shanghai in the studio that I'm based in trying to kind of like get people to express their creativity in the IDEO office and not wanting to tell you, go express your creativity, make the studio more exciting, make it yours. And so instead of doing that, I've tried to find nudging ways to encourage people to express themselves. But I only knew I was successful at this when the next slide happened, which was this image in an elevator of all places where 3 of the designers decided to create a micro exhibition of their photography. And I didn't ask anyone to do this. Just one morning, they went in there and they printed out those images, they put it up, and it has become this amazing ritual where people share their photography at the scale of an elevator so that everyone who comes into the office gets to see it and read it. And so I think this quote really stood out to me. This is from Lao Tzu, a very ancient philosopher. A leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, we did it ourselves. And this is my kind of moment of pride. They take the credit for it. They did it. It wasn't a mandate, but eventually everyone started to feel the permission to express themselves in the way they wanted. So leadership is a mindset, not a role. And connected to that also is a second thought on the next slide, which is about rethinking teams. I think, you know, the smallest unit maybe of leadership above leading oneself is this idea of leading teams. And teams are becoming the dominant way to think about organizations and how they're structured, actually. So if you look at the next slide, you know, you may have come across this book called Team of Teams. It was by an American general who wrote it. who talks about the difference between complicated situations and organizations and complex organizations. And in the military, you have a lot of people distributed usually in a lot of chaos, and you need to actually work as teams of teams to make decisions and connect to each other, and command and control from the top doesn't work that well. And so he wrote a book called Team of Teams. And we have even seen this in China in a company called Haier, which is a white goods company. If you'll see, they've shifted from this very hierarchical old model at the top of the poster on the left to the bottom. And this is a company that makes washing machines and microwaves, but they are also working in micro enterprises where the team is the most important unit within the organization. So thinking about leadership of a small group of people could end up becoming one of the dominant ways organizations organize themselves. So it's very important, and the practice you might get, even if you're leading small teams as opposed to a whole company, could be enormous. And so this is something I encourage all of you to think about, because it will serve you well beyond what you might be leading now, well into the future of different roles in leadership you might play. The second one is around this notion of creating conditions is as important as creating the work itself or doing the work. So thinking about how you set up teams for success is just as important as actually what that team gets done as a result of it, right? And so on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the power of rituals. And rituals, I think, are very important. So here's an article, again, if you want to go check it out, on Harvard Business Review, actually, this author actually doing research on looking at the performance of teams and companies who consistently practice rituals in the organization, and how they outperform or they create very powerful cultural movements within inside organizations by practicing rituals. And let me give you a couple examples of those. So the next slide is Ray Dalio's company, Bridgewater. And they are known, they're a very large hedge fund, but they are known for what happened very organically by one person starting a kind of yoga and meditation practice and offering it for free after work to some of the employees. And over time, this becoming something that has become part of Bridgewater's culture, where they now actively offer meditative classes for people. And it has been taken up by literally thousands of employees. And they have literally been able to point to higher levels of performance, efficiency, productivity, just by having this practice in place. So it's a ritual at a hedge fund, right? That is an amazing combination of two worlds that maybe on the surface you wouldn't think of. And then the next slide is actually from a company called OXO, OXO, which makes kitchen tools. But their philosophy around making pizza cutters and stirrers and frying pan flippers is that they want to design all and create these products for everyone to use. And so what they do in their office is they encourage people to collect gloves that represent very different kinds of people and very different situations of uses. So this means that all of these gloves remind them of all the different kinds of people in the world they're trying to serve with their products. So it's this great place to start as a backdrop to have a meeting to remind yourself of who your customer is. And then finally, a third one is a small ritual that we do in IDEO, and that's maker lunches. And maybe many of you have been familiar with this. We give everyone a bunch of cheap materials, we give them a brief, and everyone then has lunch, and we bring in lunch, and everyone has to create something and craft something. This is not just for the design team at IDEO. This is for our HR team, our finance team, everyone. And so encouraging everyone to get into the world of creativity is really important. All right. And then finally, on the second one, creating conditions, building cultural connections, I think, is also really important. And so I've got two examples of how to better create connections. The first is superpowers. And there's this company called SY Partners, which is a kind of like a sibling at IDEO inside of the collective we're part of. And they have created these cards. You can go to the App Store and get them. They're called Superpowers by SY Partners. And basically, it allows you to take these flashcards and pick between them and eventually land on the one that you believe is your superpower. And then it helps you think about how to leverage that superpower more and how to bring it into the work you do. and to have a conversation with the rest of your team about what yours is, what someone else's is, and then map, almost like the like the Iron Man example from earlier. You want to create that kind of like Marvel Comics group of superheroes rather than one single superpower, and know how to leverage that. And then the other one, I think, is one that I just love this quote. Whatever makes you weird is probably your greatest asset. And celebrating weirdness and recognizing you for your own lived experience and the things that have happened in your life that you planned or you didn't plan make you who you are, and can be something that creates a lot of ability to connect with others, right? And this can be very powerful. So on the next slide, this is literally an example of a project team at IDEO. These people are literally the 3 people. These are not like taken from the internet. These are pictures of the 3 people that I was thinking about how to engage and coach a project for. The person on the left, he's an engineer, but he's a former NFL football player, right? The person in the middle is a business designer, but she's also a performance artist that knits herself into a cocoon in space. And she actually gave an inspiration shot earlier on a different collectivo, of course. And then the third person is actually a World Economic Forum fellow who has done a lot of macroeconomic analysis. And I had to like bring this team together and figure out a way to bring out the individuality, because I thought it was so powerful, but do it in a way that wasn't going to create clashes, but more creates commonality, particularly as it resonates with me. So each of them, every week of the project, shared their own story of what makes them weird. And I won't share their 3 stories, but they all talked about it. And then on the 4th week, it was my turn. And if you go to the next slide, this is what I shared, which was a reflection back to how I understand or relate to each of their stories. So I happen to have played baseball, all my life and in college. And so I talked about the influence that sports and team sports in particular have had on my life. I was an actor and a performer, and so I could relate to the performance art of that second person and talked about the role of creativity and improvisation. And then the third one, as I mentioned, is from the person from the World Economic Forum. I've used motorcycle riding as a way to get me to very untraveled places in very remote parts of the world to learn about culture and connect with people I never would otherwise. So it was a way for me to connect culturally and start to build camaraderie, regardless of the content or the project that we were working on. All right, the next one, moving along. So the third one, constraints create alternatives. One of the biggest challenges on projects is there's never enough time, there's never enough money, there's never enough resources, right? And it's always too fast and too little. But actually, you can really look at some of those constraints as a huge way to stimulate creative thinking and alternatives to solve a problem, rather than why you cannot solve the problem, right? And so on the next slide, one of them comes with simply, as I mentioned, as a mindset, that leadership is a mindset, not a role. Just literally looking at these constraints and starting to think and believe that you and your team can be creative in how you solve it. And we call this at IDEO creative confidence. And so here's another book, maybe some of you have seen, called Creative Confidence by the founder of IDEO and his brother, Tom and David Kelly. And they start very much at the beginning saying everyone is creative, actually. And there are a number of ways to explore your own creativity, tap into it, and bring it to life to solve problems, particularly with extreme constraints. And one example they gave on the next slide is this notion of starting to build confidence by small wins. So Albert Bandura is a famous Stanford psychologist who was very famous for helping people get rid of their phobias. And so one of the phobias was a fear of snakes. And he quite famously ran a series of experiments where he would put a real live snake in a room, and he would take someone who's terrified of snakes and he'd put them in another room with a two-way mirror. And he would just ask them to look at the snake. And the person knew that the snake couldn't get to them. So they did. And then 10 minutes later, he'd ask them to move out of the room, and he'd open the door to the room with the snake in it. And he'd ask them just to stand there and stay there and watch the snake for 10 minutes. Then he'd ask the person to enter the door and stand just inside the door and watch the snake. Then he'd have someone else go over to the snake and touch it. Then he would have that person who's terrified of snakes put on a very thick glove and go over and barely touch the snake. Within 2 hours, he had people that had their whole lives been terrified of snakes, picking up snakes and handling them. What he discovered about that was not only did they get rid of their phobia within 2 hours instantly, but it built confidence in the rest of their life to tackle things they're afraid of. And so is this notion of small wins and building confidence over time that was incredibly powerful about this. And he kind of demonstrated this scientifically and psychologically. And then the next thing around constraints, create alternatives is asking different or great questions. So sometimes you get into the trap of, the question is what makes it impossible to solve with your constraints, because you might be asking the wrong question. And on the next slide, I don't know if you've come across this, but this number 300 is this notion that this is the number of questions a child asks per day. And so this is where we all start as human beings. This is actually how we learn. This is actually how we get good at things, and how we make sense of the world when we're children is by constantly asking why, what's that? How does that work? Well, why do I have to do that? Why is that like that? And we over time get conditionally trained to stop asking questions, and as leaders having to have all the answers instead. And we don't live in a world where any of us can have all the answers. I'll tell you, I hate to break it to you, but it'll never happen. So getting good at asking questions is actually, on the next slide, something that really actually makes us human. It's actually one of the most powerful things we have, and the most powerful paths to solving big problems with constraints. And one of the types of questions that actually Colectivo uses all of the time is on the next slide, which is how might we, right? And it's very intentionally built as a question and grammatical structure, because the how might we question is an open-ended and a generative question. It generates ideas. So how might we do something is a question that starts with a how, which is descriptive and very solution oriented. It implies we want to figure something out. Might implies that there's potential, there's optimism or generativeness. It's not prescriptive on what you need to do. It's could this be possible? And then we is collective, it's inclusive. It's not about how I might solve something. It's all about how do we do it together, right? And let me give you an example of how might we question could be really powerful. So Doug Dietz is an engineer from GE. And GE, he's been engineering and creating, on this next slide, basically MRI machines for decades. He's an expert, world-renowned in it. And whenever he designs a new iteration of this machine, historically, he's gone into where this machine is implemented, he's met the technician, and he's constantly asking, is the machine working accurately? Is it working better than last time? Is it more efficient? And he always gets, yes, absolutely. And he always walks away thinking he has done an amazing job, and he's the best designer of these machines in the world. And then one day he walked out of one of these rooms and he saw a father bringing in his daughter, and his daughter was crying and hysterical. And he realized these machines were terrifying children. And in fact, children had to be put under anesthesia just to go through them. And that destroyed his world. He almost quit his job because he had no idea that much pain was being created by these machines. So he went to Stanford D School, actually, and he learned how might we questions. And on the next slide, he wanted to solve this problem. So he formed a question of how might we improve the scanning experience for children. Now, this is an engineer of a medical device starting to figure out, how do I solve this problem of children being terrified? And through asking that different question and using some creative process, on the next slide, he came up with this, which has nothing to do with engineering, but everything to do with what a child might need to go through an experience in a way where they don't have to be put under anesthesia. And actually, children now ask to come back and do it again tomorrow. So these rides on the next slide are actually these amazing things that captivate the imagination of children and engage them in a way where they go in and hold still, and it's not terrifying and it won't hurt them, and it ignites their imagination. So an engineer of a medical device has given himself permission to ask a different question to improve his machine. And then finally, the last one is on aligning on what good looks like leads to shared success. So having a common definition of what you are trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it ensures that you as a leader can track how people are doing. And so two quick things, and then I'm done. The first on the next slide is about making agreements. So at the beginning of any project at IDEO, the first thing the lead does is sit down with the team and say, what are the agreements we want to make as a team as to how this project is going to go? Here's an example of an exercise on the next slide, and I won't read all of these, but you can see these are examples of some of my favorite reasons people have given when I ask the question, I do my best work when. So answers like, I feel trusted, or I have the permission to fail, or I can play to my strengths, or I'm passionate about what we're going to do, or I have the resources I need, right? So if you use this almost as a checklist as a leader to say, am I creating permission for people to feel like they can take risks? Do I understand what people's passions are? And have I thought about how to relate this project to their passions? What kinds of resources and constraints are we dealing with? And how do I help them see that as a positive, et cetera, right? So these are very powerful at the beginning to set kind of the tone. And then the second one is around giving feedback. And so there's this great book on the next slide that I would encourage you all to check out. It's around this notion of radical candor. And I'll just read what it says here from the author. Radical candor is about giving feedback, by the way. So the reason it's called radical is because it's rare, not because it doesn't encompass compassion or because it's rude. So radical candor is not brutal honesty. Radical candor is what happens when you're able to care personally about someone and challenge them directly at the same time. It's a simple idea. It's not easy to do. It's the idea of being able to give hard feedback that's critical of people, but doing it in service of them and with good intent. So that's what people appreciate the most, is real feedback of what they need to approve, but delivered in a way where they believe that the person giving it is in service of you, right? So that it doesn't hurt, it actually is constructive. And so that last example I'll end with is that I got this piece of feedback early in my IDEO career. I was sitting in front of a chairman of a very large company, and literally about a half hour into that presentation the project I was leading, he pounded his fist on the table and was screaming across the table at me, telling me this was completely wrong. And we were completely unaligned, and there were about 60 people in the room. And at that time, there was also a partner from IDEO sitting next to me. And we got through that meeting and I felt completely destroyed. And he pulled me aside and I thought he was just going to yell at me again. And what he said is, that meeting was horrible, but you were fantastic. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, the way you carried yourself, the way you articulated, you led very well. It's just that we are not aligned on these things. So separate what you were doing and how you were thinking from the moment that we were in. And that was the moment I built my confidence out of what was the worst meeting of my career. So that was very valuable feedback, and it helped me move on and build my own. So to leave you with these four, just to recap, the first one is leadership is a mindset, not just a role. Secondly is that creating conditions is as important as creating the work. Thirdly, constraints can create alternatives if you use your creativity with the team to solve them. And then fourth, aligning on what good looks like can lead to shared success and you all kind of being on the same page. So I know that was really fast, but I look forward to any questions you might have at the end of this session. And thank you so much for allowing me to share today.